I'd like to welcome everybody to the third Reporters Night here at Columbia University. I'm Steve Cohen, a professor in the practice of public affairs here at Columbia and director of the Sustainability Management Program at our Earth Institute and School of Professional Studies. I'd like to first thank our very own Claudia Dreyfus for putting this virtual event together for Columbia's students and faculty, as well as for the general public. The goal of this series is to learn from reporters on the front lines about critical issues we're facing, namely COVID-19 and climate change tonight. Claudia is a faculty colleague of mine at both the School of International and Public Affairs and the School of Professional Studies, as well as a distinguished science feature writer for the New York Times. Claudia is also a lecturer in the Sustainability Management Program and teaches a terrific course that's called Writing About Global Science for the International Media. And her students are joining us here tonight on the call. Tonight, Claudia's guest is Naomi Oreskes, a professor in the history of science at Harvard University. And she co-authored the best-selling book, Merchants of Doubt, with Eric M. Conway, written about how the tobacco industry altered scientific evidence to falsely represent the dangers of smoking. She most recently published another book titled Why Trust Science? As a response to climate change denial and anti-vaccination sentiments. Tonight's discussion will be centered around why science's credibility is so valuable to the public during a pandemic, such as the one in which we find ourselves. We'll also unpack why some of the coronavirus spread can be attributed to scientific distrust and how the scientific community can fight back against fake news from politicians and citizens. We're really excited to have Dr. Oreskes at Columbia today, and we're looking forward to learning more from her research. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Claudia, for what I know will be a really interesting evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. Welcome to the students from my seminar, Writing About Global Science for the International Media. The co-host has asked me to start my video. Let me start again. Thank you, Professor Cohen, and thank you so much. Welcome to my students from my seminar, Writing About Global Science for the International Media. And welcome to all the scientists and researchers at the Earth Institute, where tomorrow they're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day. And welcome, of course, to all you guests and friends out there in Zoom land. We're very pleased you could join us. And let me say this, a decade ago, a book and an author appeared on the public square, and our perception of science and scientists totally changed. The book was this, and let me hold it up, but I've got it right here. It was called Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. Book's still in print. It's used in classes around the world. I use it in my class. We're going to use it this summer in the summer session of my class. It remains a hot seller. And the reason for that, that a book could last 10 years, is that it's the basic text in understanding disinformation in the sciences. It shows how our trust in science can be manipulated by special interests for political reasons. I'm sure many of you have seen it already. I use it in my classes, I've mentioned. But what's really interesting is that a few months ago, Dr. Oreskes, who teaches the history of science, published a kind of sequel to Merchants of Doubt, call it Son or Daughter of Merchants of Doubt. And the title of the book this time is, as Dr. Cohen mentioned, Why Trust Science? The new book was aimed at anti-vaxxers and at climate change deniers. And the book argues that the collective process of science is in and of itself trustworthy, and it's self-correcting by nature. The book was published months before the coronavirus pandemic went global, but in it, Dr. Oreskes is almost an oracle in that she shows how doubting the work of scientists got us into this parade of death and disaster that we're all living through. Now, full disclosure here, Naomi Oreskes is a source that I often go to in stories I'm writing, but she's also a friend. Even a journalist can have a personal friend who's someone you learn from, and one would hope so. And whenever I talk with Naomi Oreskes, I learn something new. Tonight, I hope we'll learn things new. I know we will. We're going to learn something important about what happens to our lives when politics runs up against the scientific enterprise. So welcome to Columbia, Naomi Oreskes. Welcome to the School of Professional Studies. Let's kick off the evening with the most basic of questions. What is it about science and the processes that are involved that make it trustworthy?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Claudia, for the incredibly generous introduction, although I feel a bit intimidated now because it's a bit of pressure to be an oracle.
Well, yeah, but you must admit your book was prescient.
Well, thank you. I do think it was. It's gratifying. It's also a little scary. It's a complicated thing, but thank you for those kinds. So to try to answer your question. So the short answer to the question, what is it that makes science trustworthy, makes the scientific process trustworthy, is the collective vetting of claims. Scientists, I think I know something. I don't just announce it to the world and say, this is the way things are. Before I get the opportunity to do that, I go through a pretty and complicated process my claims to critical scrutiny. That means I present my claims to shops, I attend international or national conferences, I might circulate a preprint of my ideas among my colleagues, and then I ultimately publish it in a peer-reviewed journal where it goes through peer review. Reason for all of this, because this is a process of critical scrutiny. It's not for me to simply assert that something is the case. I have to demonstrate, and I have to subject my claims to the critical scrutiny of colleagues who are pretty tough and who will look for flaws in my claims, who will look for my reasoning, who will look for inadequacies in my data. And it's only after a claim goes through that whole collective process that it gets to be peer-reviewed literature. And it's only after many papers of that type get published in the peer-reviewed literature that we generally make the claim that something is known scientifically. So it's a very tough process. It involves the collective efforts of lots of people. So we have a kind of cliche in our culture that two heads are better than one. In science, no claim is accepted until it's been looked at and thought about by many, many heads, often hundreds of thousands, or in the case of climate change, even tens of thousands of pretty smart heads.
One of the things you argue in the book is that the contentious nature of academic life actually works as a kind of a fail-safe to make sure that things are accurate. This is the only time I've ever heard anyone say a good thing about that. Can you say more?
That was actually one of the fun things that emerged out of this book. I always say, scholar, you know that your work is going in a good direction when you discover things you didn't anticipate yourself, or even better, you actually change your mind about something. So as you just said, in the past, I never really thought about the nastiness of academic life, the competitive nature, the contentious nature as being a good thing. I certainly heard many of my female students complain about it and say that it bothers them that they're so nasty and that they up and that they yell and scream. But in the process of writing and thinking hard about the critical scrutiny, I came to the conclusion that on some level, that nastiness is kind of necessary. I mean, I'm not saying we have to be jerks or that we should call each other names, but that scrutiny, that really tough scrutiny where people get up at meetings and say, I don't believe this, or I don't believe you, or I'm not persuaded by that claim, or I don't think you have enough data. That tough scrutiny is really crucial to the process. So yes, we could try to do it politely, and we, as much as possible, do it politely. And I don't think we have to call each other names, but I do think we have to be really tough, because it's in that toughness, that intellectual back and forth, what some folks have agonistic, the sort of give and take and pull of scientific debate. That's really where we figure out whether claims stand up or not.
When we talked about Why Trust Science, which was last summer, 10 years ago, really, New York, we talked about it for the New York Review of Books where I was interviewing you. You said you had written it to answer some of the questions posed by anti-vaccine activists and climate change deniers, because when you'd go out and give speeches, they would, ask you antagonistic questions, and you really thought long and hard about how you could answer them. At the time you were writing the book, did you think these attitudes could bring us to a moment when they would be a cofactor in a pandemic?
Well, I'm not a historian of medicine. My background is all in the physical sciences and mathematics, not in biology or medicine. So I certainly wasn't consciously thinking about pandemics, but I certainly thinking about the fact that many of the scientific issues that we study are very serious matters that affect our health, our well-being, our prosperity, and in some cases are, in fact, questions of life and death. So one of the cases that I look at is the case of the contraceptive pill, and I look at the question of why it took scientists a long time to accept the evidence that hormonal contraceptions can cause depression and even suicide in patients who take them. So that was a case where there was evidence that was attended to by some scientists, but it was neglected and discounted by others. I use that to explore the question of about cases where scientists make mistakes. And that was a case of life and death, because there were women who committed suicide on oral contraceptives. And we do have good evidence that now say with certainty that for some people, and particularly in the early years when the doses were very high, that so it's a little bit now, although oral contraceptives, even at much lower doses, can cause depression in some patients. For some subset of those patients, this can in fact be a matter of death.
Well, run us through why the anti-vaxxers and, let's say, climate deniers set us up in some way for some of the strange things we're seeing regarding the pandemic.
Well, this is a long and complicated story, and I've written, I would say, 3 books relevant to this question. I'm working on a 4th one now, so it'd be hard. It's me to keep the answers focused, and this is a tough question to answer in a short way, but I'll do my best. What Eric Conway and I showed in Merchants of Doubt was that the rejection of science related to climate change, environmental health issues, had nothing to do with the science. It wasn't because those weren't good. It wasn't because there wasn't enough data. It wasn't because people were having a bold argument about mechanistic versus probabilistic explanations. None of that. It was about none of that. What it was about the politics, not just of climate change, but of all these issues, because it was really about the politics of regulation and the politics of limited government. So what do I mean by that? What we showed in the book was people who were organized to challenge the scientific evidence of climate change, acid rain, the ozone hole, of tobacco. Well, first of all, we discovered, and this was sort of the big discovery that made us realize we had a book to write, was that they were all the same people. That over and over and over again, we had seen the same people challenge science on very diverse issues. And so that was the first clue that this was not a principled scientific debate, because if it were, we should have seen different experts showing up. The people who are experts on oncology are quite different than the people who would be experts on the atmospheric chemistry that leads to acid precipitation. It would be different people than the people who do global climate modeling. So the very fact that the same people were involved in all these debates was an early clue that something fishy was going on. And what we found by digging into their papers, their letters, their published articles, their op-eds, and their private letters to each other, because we found a very useful trove of that, was that for them, this was all about governance. It was about the question of whether or not the government should intervene in the marketplace to correct market failures. And what these people believed was that the answer to that was no. And the reason they thought it was no is because they feared that once the government would begin to intervene in the marketplace to fix an environmental problem like acid rain or the ozone hole, then it was only a matter of time before government would grow out of control and would become tyrannical. And so it was this slippery slope argument, today it's acid rain, but tomorrow it's the Bill of Rights. And we actually found them saying some of their writings. This was the reason that they felt justified challenging the scientific evidence on all these different issues. So now fast forward to the present, we've seen in the last few weeks the exact same pattern playing out. We saw a president who was very reluctant to involve the federal government who resist the idea that this is an appropriate role for the federal government to respond to a pandemic, who consistently in the beginning, actually, he and some of his people said the private sector would respond. Kennelly testified in Congress that it was the administration's view that this should be left to the place. Then when it was clear that that was not an adequate answer, they said, well, we're going to leave it to people to make their own decisions. And then when it became clear that wasn't an adequate answer, then they said, okay, well, we're leaving it to the states, the governors. And we're seeing that play out in real time now with different governors taking very different approaches. The states competing with each other for equipment, and a lot of complications that could have been solved if our administration had been comfortable with and willing to take on a strong, coordinated, centralized federal response. But that was precisely what he wouldn't do. So for Eric Conway and I, having written on this, that for us was totally predictable and frankly tragic, because we have strong scientific evidence that if we had sooner, the death rate would have been much lower.
You recently did an op-ed where you talked about how these policies or these failed policies aren't new. In fact, a lot of them are rooted in the ideas of the much revered Ronald Reagan. Can you say more?
What we showed in Merchants was that this pattern of rejecting scientific evidence whose implications you didn't like really begins with Ronald Reagan. So before Reagan, we have Republican presidents like Richard Nixon or Dwight Eisenhower, who you may or may not respect. Richard Nixon hasn't gone down in history as one of America's greatest presidents, but he was not actually anti-scientific. He accepted the scientific evidence of the harms of air pollution, for example. And as we know, he signed the Clean Air Act, signed the Clean Water Act. He signed the bill that created the Environmental Protection Agency. He accepted that the scientific evidence was legitimate, and he understood. I mean, one thing about Nixon, he was a strange person, but he was a savvy politician in many ways. He understood that the American people wanted action on these issues. But things changed with Ronald Reagan. Reagan was so committed to the ideology of limited government. And you may recall when he was elected president, the centerpiece of his inaugural address was the oft-quoted saying, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. Ronald Reagan demonized government. He made us believe that the federal government was our enemy, that the federal government took our money and taxes and gave us nothing back, and basically set in place 40 years of Republican policies aimed at weakening the power of the federal government, particularly in the area of environmental protection and public health. And we have seen this playing out. And again, it is no surprise that in the middle of this pandemic, what is Donald Trump trying to do? Back environmental protections even more, roll back worker protections, all of the things that have been used as excuses to undermine the federal role in protecting the American people. This has been going on since Ronald Reagan, and it's really been a continuous theme in Republican presidencies since Reagan.
Well, taking it out of the political realm and just talking about the activities of everyday citizens, despite all evidence, when you see kids on the beach at Fort Lauderdale during spring break, or conservative groups demonstrating against sheltering in place as they did last week, or religious people attending Easter services, where does that fit into your thesis? Why are people not taking the science seriously?
Well, I think most people look to theirs for how to behave on most issues. And particularly this is true in science. We don't expect ordinary people to be reading the Journal of the American Medical Association. In fact, behind a paywall, even if they wanted to, they might not be able to get hold of it. And even if they did get hold of it, they probably wouldn't understand it. So it's not really realistic to expect that ordinary people would be reading peer-reviewed scientific publications. Ordinary people look to leaders to give them guidance on complex issues. And for most people, that means political leaders. So Republicans tend to look to Republican leaders. And if our president is Republican, then they'll look to him. Democrats look to Democrats. So they'll look to Democratic senators or governors, or possibly Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden. So if we have strong political affinities, we will look to our political leaders. We will also look to religious leaders. We'll look to community leaders. We might look to the NBA. I think it's quite significant after the NBA announced that it was going to shut down basketball games. There was I think, a noticeable change in the public conversation, because many of us follow sports and lots of Americans really care about basketball. So it's not surprising that public opinion polls show that Republicans are much less likely to take the issue seriously than Democrats, because Republican leadership has taken the issue less seriously. And again, it's not surprising this divide between the governors, with Democratic governors by and large taking it quite seriously. Republican governors are a little more split. There are certainly Republican governors who are taking the scientific evidence quite seriously, and their credit, but we are also seeing some Republican governors, quite, well, the other day I coined the phrase belligerent ignorance. I mean, there is a kind of unbelievable ignorance in some places in this country. And my view is, if you're ignorant, well, then it's me as a professor to teach. But when people are belligerent about their ignorance, then that's pretty upsetting. And we're certainly see this playing out right now, for example, in Tennessee, where you have a Republican governor insisting it needs to reopen, but you have the Democratic mayor office saying, well, actually, that would be a pretty thing to do. So here we can see how the political affiliations of the leadership are structuring how people respond to this problem.
Well, about believing the science and the scientists, let's face it, if you do believe them, it's all mighty inconvenient. Nobody seems to like being locked up and sheltered down. And it's just like if you were a smoker, you don't like hearing the news about smoking and lung cancer. And if you drive a car, it may mean that you're going to be using up a lot of gasoline. So all of what scientists are saying requires a kind of drastic change in attitude. And it seems to me like the doubters have the advantage of saying, you don't have to do this, it's phony. But this is different, don't you think? There's evidence around that isn't obtuse, that isn't a mathematical model. People are dying all around us. I know of 5 people in my wider circle who are dead, and everybody sees this. And yet they're all hoping that they can go out in May.
Yeah, well, first of all, condolences on the people you've lost. I think this coronavirus has really brought to a fore an incredibly sharp relief, this whole set of issues that we're coping with in these problems we face that are you could call bad news stories. And, Claudia, you and I have talked about this before, right? So one of the things that COVID-19 has in common with climate change or the ozone hole or the harms of tobacco is that it's a bad story. And, yourself, you're a reporter, know it's bad news, right? So you're absolutely right. The people who say, don't worry, it's all going to be fine, we'll get a vaccination, or, well, the death rate's not really that bad.
It's killing old people who would go on Social Security anyway.
Yeah, old people would die anyway. Their story is the more reassuring story. And, I think Al Gore got this right a long ago. Climate is an inconvenient truth. The ozone hole was an inconvenient truth, except now it's not just convenient, actually deadly. And so you might have thought, you just said, that people would get it, that this is acute, that people are dying from this thing, that if we don't act promptly and in a pretty disciplined way, the death rate will be very, very catastrophic. And part of what's happened the last couple of weeks, which is so really, I think it's a tragedy. I feel like we're watching a tragedy in real time. Is that a month ago, I actually felt like people were getting it. It seemed like people were hunkering down, people were willingly staying home, and almost nobody was really objecting. I mean, nobody predicted, and certainly, the advice columns were filled with people saying, oh my God, how do I cope working at home with 3 children running around? But people were doing it. What's really tragic to me about the last week or two is the way we've seen this belligerent ignorance, this belligerent defiance on the part of some Republican governors, not all, but some, this kind of reckless public health and safety. And the only thing I can say about that is I think there's at least 2 things operating here, probably more, but at least 2. One is the ideology of limited governance, that the government shouldn't be telling people what to do. The governor of South Dakota said this explicitly. She said, I think people's personal safety is their own responsibility. Well, that's true up to a point. We can agree with that up to a point. But it's also true that all problems look different depending on where you are. There's the old saying, where you stand depends upon where you sit. If you're in New York and you know people who are dying, it's pretty strong motivation to stay home and to follow the directives and to pay attention. But if you're in South Dakota where, very few people have died and people live apart, you may feel like, well, I don't really get why I need to do this. And so in that sense, for people in rural areas in states that have not yet been strongly affected, COVID-19, I think, looks a lot like climate change. It looks like a problem that's far away in space and time. And so all those instincts of denial and dismissal can kick in. And I think that is what we've seen in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, the fact that there isn't consistent leadership makes whatever point they have people going back to the malls really scary. But
exactly.
Now, we were talking, well, let me ask you about this, Anthony Fauci. I watch him with great fascination because day after day, he hears the president say things that may or may not be true, but often are not true. And he stands there and his whole reputation is on the line. And you just sense that he's also feeling, if I resign, God knows what could happen. What do you think's going on in his head? Do you dare speculate?
Well, I don't know. I don't know Dr. Fauci, but I think it's what you just said. I assume that he is trying to walk a fine line. He's trying to do a balancing act where he knows that he has the potential to do enormous good in that role. He knows that he does have the respect of the people, and he knows the people are listening. And I think there's no question he's done an enormous amount of good. He's been extremely effective in many, many ways over the last couple of months. And I think that he feels strongly that by staying in that role, he can continue to do good. But it's obviously very delicate, because when the president says things that are false, that he knows false, if he calls, he may well get fired, and he doesn't want to get fired. I think he's done a pretty admirable job of walking that fine line. I think he's made it clear when the president has said things that are clearly unsupportable. There may come a point in which, however, he may have to make a different choice. And I've been asked about this a few times in the last few weeks by I think there can be a point where if things get too bad, it is important for scientists in positions of influence to resign in protest, because at some point, if scientists don't stand up for the truth, then later on the American people will say, well, wait a second, back when that thing you said it was all okay, you said to wear a face mask or whatever it is. So it's a very tough place for scientists at CDC and at NIH right now. I think so far Dr. Fauci has done an amazingly great job. I hope he won't have to resign, but I do think that there are times there are times in the affairs of men. And I was thinking the other day, I had the opportunity to talk with Richard Garwin, who's one of my big heroes, probably not known to any of your students, but Garwin is famous in the annals of the history of science because he stood up against Richard Nixon on the question of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Nixon wanted to build an early version of what we now call Star Wars, to try to ballistic missiles as they were coming in. Garwin and other scientists argued that it would be highly destabilizing and could attribute to the risk of war. And it was a very, very contentious issue. And Nixon was strongly in favor of developing this anti-ballistic system. Garwin scientists were strongly opposed. Nixon was pushing it forward despite the scientists' views. And so Garwin spoke out in public against it. And Nixon fired not only him, but the entire president's science advisory. And so this is often used in classes in my field, in history of science, as an interesting about, did he do the right thing? He stood up for what he did right. He made it clear to the American people and to Congress that this system is foolhardy, but it cost the existence of the President's Science Advisory Committee. So that was a tough call, and scientists often do face tough calls. I think in that particular case, my view is that Richard Garwin did the right thing, but I obviously can't make that call for any other scientists in any particular situation.
Let me ask you one question before we go to the students who have some great questions for you. I know that you grew up in a highly political family. Your parents were active in the civil rights movement. Um, and you went into science, you became a geologist to kind of get away from that. And now it's galloping after you. What do you make of that?
Well, my good friend Jim L., who's a minister in the United Church, tells me that you can't escape your destiny. So I have to say the last few weeks, plagues, locusts, earthquakes in Utah, it's like it's feeling like God is pretty angry at us. So I don't know. I think I don't know if I have destiny or not, but sometimes problems present themselves and they're in front of you. Um, you kind of have a moral obligation to step up to the plate, and that's how I think about the last 10 years of my own life. A certain set of problems that I didn't look for this issue, pursuing it. Certainly never thought when I was in graduate school that I would be the problem of political misrepresentation of scientific evidence. Not a sentence that would have ever come out of my mouth 30 years ago. But here I am. Sometimes life makes choice for us. We don't know make our choices. Sometimes life makes the choice for us.
Well, my students have some wonderful questions to ask you, so let's go to them. Are we, Peter? Are we all online with the students? Are they? I don't see their pictures or anything. Can we see them? I saw that Hannah was online. Hannah is a tiger researcher, works with live tigers. And Hannah, introduce yourself and your question, please.
Hi. Oh, yep, I'm on.
You're on.
Sorry, just making sure that I'm on. Hi, again, my name is Hannah. I'm a second-year master's student at Columbia with the Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology program. So I'm studying behavioral ecology in tigers up at the Bronx Zoo, which is really cool. I'm also graduating this semester with that as my thesis. So my question today is that I see a lot of people in my program talk about issues we see in the media with climate denial, denial of environmental topics, or just a general lack of talking about them or caring about them. And my question is, in your opinion, what do you think caused this mistrust in scientists, and how do we reverse it?
Question, and I have to ask the question first. Is it true that a tiger developed COVID-19?
Oh, yes. So one tiger was tested positive, and a couple others were exhibiting symptoms, and a couple of those were potentially one of the ones that I used in my study.
Oh, wow. And are the tigers okay?
They should be recovering, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. I was like, I know
what does a tiger nurse look like?
Very worried about the tigers at the Bronx Zoo. So I'll be able to sleep better tonight. Thank you for that. Question's a very important one, but it's also important to clarify. There's actually a lot of misapprehension about this question. So it's simply not true that there's a general crisis of distrust scientists or science. We have a lot of public opinion polls on this issue. The Pew Center has done some really fine on this issue. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences published a big report just about a year ago on this issue. Public opinion polls consistently show that the vast majority of American people do trust science on most issues. And that's really important for us to keep in mind, because if we want to solve any problem, we have to first know what the problem is. And if we mischaracterize the problem, then we'll rush into all kinds of remedies that will be not effective. The vast majority of people are with us on the scientific issues. The vast majority of men like science, they trust scientists, and scientists by and large are much more trusted than other professionals, for example, businessmen, politicians, or I'm sorry to say, journalists. So the good news. The news is essentially what we've already been talking about tonight. It's the implicatory denial. Reject science when you don't like its implications. So what we know is that there are some specific areas of science where there are certain numbers of Americans who reject the scientific results. And the big three are climate change, evolutionary biology, and vaccinations. Now, vaccinations are interesting. I think anyone who's looking at a research project, there's one that would be great to do that's unfolding in front of our eyes. Will the COVID-19 crisis change the views of the American people on vaccinations. We have a lot of people now waiting vaccination. The only way this problem really gets solved fully, well, there are essentially two solutions to this problem. One is that we all get sick and something like 3% of us die. That would be not a very attractive one. Or scientists develop a vaccine and we have large-scale vaccination within the next year and a half. That, to most people, certainly to me, is a much better solution than seeing hundreds of thousands of people die. So we have a lot of now resting their hopes on a vaccination. And if we get that vaccination, and if it brings an end to this difficult period that we're in and saves lives, I think there's a good chance we'll see that the anti-vaccine movement will really have its feet cut out from it. Because part of the problem with the anti-vaccine movement is that the Americans have forgotten what it's like when we live in a world with infectious diseases that killed huge numbers of people. I mean, Claudia and I are to remember.
Polio.
Yeah, but polio, I mean, our parents were terrified of polio. My husband talked about how his parents would never let him swim in a pool after there was a polio vaccine. This thing was so deep, psyche and the consciousness of the American people. When I was a child growing up, there was a child in my apartment building who was in a wheelchair because he had encephalitis as a consequence from measles. So we knew what these diseases were, and we knew that they could kill people or leave them to disabled. But then, you know, in a way, we've been victims of our own success. Vaccination has been so successful that most Americans younger than a certain age don't remember polio, don't remember measles, don't remember the rubella umbrella, all these things that were a huge part of an earlier generation. They don't remember diphtheria, pertussis. In fact, a doctor I saw recently told me that there was a case of pertussis at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital here in Boston, and they asked the patient if he would overnight, even though he really did to, because the doctors wanted to come and see it because there were all these young docs who had never seen this disease. So now we've had this giant reminder of why infectious diseases are such a serious threat. I remind the positive value of vaccination. That may or may not change how people view the issue, and I think studying that in the next few months could be incredibly interesting. That said, these other two are a little bit different. And we know why people reject evolutionary biology, and we know why people climate. These are not mysteries. Conservatives reject climate science because they fear that it shows us a market failure, a giant failure of capitalism as we practice it. And it tells us that you cannot just leave everything to the magic of the marketplace, to use that cliche, because when you do, you end up with giant problems that the marketplace cannot solve. Right-wing ideologues, the libertarians, the advocates of limited government, low taxation, they do not want to accept the reality of climate change because they don't want to accept the necessity of intervention. And particularly, most economists would say the solution would be similar to carbon, but we know the conservatives in this country had a long history of being opposed to taxation. They have a carbon tax is very anathema to their ideological and political principles. So the solution to that then is not to give these people more science. It won't work. You have to political side. And some things of biology, again, sorry to go on at some length, but these are complicated questions. In the case of evolutionary biology, we know, again, that the reason why people who reject evolution theory do so, by and large, I mean, this is a generalization, but we have a lot of evidence to support it. It's because they think that evolutionary theory either says there's no God or life is random and meaningless. Well, you know what? Evolutionary theory doesn't tell us whether there's a God, and evolutionary theory does not say that life is random and meaningless. So there are ways to address concerns, but they don't involve giving people more science. And so it's really important to understand this idea of implicatory denial, denying something like its implications, because then you could actually discuss those implications and out that at least in some cases, there are solutions that these people are okay about, or that the implication drawing, for example, that there's no God, that actually that's not true. Evolutionary theory does not disprove the existence of God.
So let us go on because the students really have great questions. Sydney Hibbert, you're in Hong Kong now. Are you out of quarantine?
Hi, I'm out of quarantine now. Yes. Hi, Dr. Oreskes. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. My name is Sydney Hibbert again, and I'm a master's student studying sustainability management at Columbia. My question for you today is, it seems like many scientists today, especially ones that interact with the media, are being turned to for questions about policy and regulation. What do you think of this, and what is your response, and what is the scientist's role in deciding policy and regulations?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it short because I know Claudia wants me to answer lots of questions.
Short,
I think it's
short.
I think it's terrible. I think that this is a mistake journalists make and that scientists fall into. Journalists should not be asking scientists policy regulation. They're not on that area. They should be asking scientists about this. What does it mean to say, that the disease has a reproduction rate of this, or what does it mean to talk about the virulence of a virus, right? Ask scientists scientific questions. But if the question about regulation and policy, then scientists are not the experts in that area. And this is one of the central arguments of my book, Science, is to say, we have good reason to believe that science as a process yields reliable results about scientific questions. But if the question is there a God? Should we have a carbon tax? Is life meaningful? What is the meaning of life? Scientists are not only not the experts to answer those questions, but really often they're very ill-equipped because the very specialization that leads them experts about coronaviruses actually leads often to be rather of some of the other questions. So I think it's extremely important for journalists to be sensitive to the expertise, and it's extremely important for scientists to be able to say, hey, you know what? I'm really not an expert on that, but can I refer you to my colleague over here in the government department or my colleague over here in public health? That's what we all need to do.
So on that, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question and ask you not to answer it because we're going to get to more students. But don't you think I think that a lot of the journalists who are questioning political leaders at this moment about the virus should know a little more science than they do, and so that when they're lied to, they know what they're doing. Anyway, don't answer the question. Let's talk to Sean Fallon. Sean, how are you in New York City? Our students are kind of in the diaspora at the moment. Sean.
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Oreskes, for being here with us. My name is Shane Fallon.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah.
I'm a sustainability management Master of Science student here at Columbia. And my question for you is around who I thought was one of the more intriguing characters in the Merchant of Doubt film. That was a former Congressman, Bob Inglis from South Carolina, who called himself the most conservative. He was from the most conservative most conservative county in the most conservative state. And his change of heart as he, learned more of the science. And I'm just curious whether you think that it's possible for other very conservative people like him to ultimately see the light when it comes to climate change.
Thanks for that question, Shane. Look, I know that many conservatives in Congress know that climate change is real. I think we know that they know that it's by people, natural, but they've boxed themselves into a corner and they don't know how to get out of it. And so I think that at this moment, it's extremely important for people to leadership, people, not me. I mean, no Republican from Louisiana is going to look with me, not now anyway, although I would happily appear with them if they were willing. But I think this is really a time for the business community to step up to the plate, because many of the project climate science claiming so to protect the economy. I mean, we're hearing that today with claiming we need to reopen the economy. We need to not listen to the scientists on COVID-19 because we protect the economy. This false argument. It's a false dichotomy. We have tons of evidence to show that that's the case. But because this argument has been many times, because many people believe it to be the case, I think we really desperately need leadership from the business community. And my touchstone here was that April Fool's joke that maybe some of you saw about how Google announced that it was going to stop climate change denial and was going for leadership. I don't know if you saw this, but it was an absolutely brilliant. If you haven't seen it, you Google it. And it turned out it was an April Fool's prank staged by the Extinction Rebellion group. But actually, I think it's exactly right. So I'm working on a column right now for Scientific American in which I'm going to put it to Google, like, why not? Why couldn't you do this? Why couldn't you say it has come to stop funding aisle to take this and to work together with conservatives in Congress to come up with solutions. And, you know, for years, because I've worked on this, because I've read so much literature, I understand the argument of limited government. And I mean, look, nobody unlimited government, right? There's obviously a rational or principled argument to have about what is the right balance between government intervention versus personal choice. And that's a legitimate argument that we could have as long as people aren't denying the facts, denying the science. So this is where leadership becomes so important. We need business leaders to step up plate to say, it's time to have that conversation. And my view on this is, I always say, I think we should try to solve climate change with the smallest intervention that will do the job.
Well, very interesting. Jasmine, who is the TA in my class, would you introduce yourself and your question?
Hi, thanks so much for being here and for this conversation. I'm a TA and I'm finishing an MFA in nonfiction writing in the School of the Arts. So I have a writing question for you as a writer who's written across genres and engaged both fact and speculation. I'm wondering whether you discovered any unique narrative advantages to writing fiction about climate.
Oh, well, there's many advantages to writing fiction. And if I could be reborn in another realm, you know, another form, I'd like to be, well, either be a novelist or a stand-up comedian, because of course, incredibly constraining. And, you know, I think that what I do is really tough, right? Everything I say has to be true and it has to be fact checkable. And when I write for newspapers or American, it is fact checked very carefully. And I respect the fact checkers and I appreciate the work they do on my behalf. But, you know, you just want to make a point. And sometimes there's a point that you know is true emotionally. You know, that, you know, and we sometimes use the expression something ring you. And sometimes you have an intuition about something that you're pretty sure is right because you've read a lot, you've thought about it, but you couldn't necessarily find a source that would necessarily back up. And this is one of the constraints of narrative nonfiction. Now, of course, there are ways to get around it in nonfiction. You can tell after 30 study, I've come to the conclusion that, but that's kind of tedious and clunky. It would be a whole lot better if a character could just say it, right? So, you know, I think fiction is a gift. And if I write more fiction, I would. So I think who has the capacity to write fiction should absolutely, and we have some models out there now. I think Roy Scranton's work is really interesting. Amitav Ghosh, you know, has worked climate change into lots of his stories. And nonfiction out climate change as well, but climate change in all of his recent work. Kim Stanley Robinson has written some, you know, science fiction climate stories. So yeah, I mean, if you can do it, sure, go for it. And I think also because there are a lot of people love fiction, people love reading novels. There are many people who read a fictional account of a serious issue who might not read my books. And then, of course, there's also an example of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And, you know, anyone who's read Uncle Tom's Cabin knows it's not a great work of fiction, right? But it was a great work and it was really influential. When I was writing The Collapse of Western Civilization, that was actually kind of the model I had in mind. That sounds a little egotistical because obviously I'm not Harriet Beecher Stowe, but that was what I was thinking about, the idea that you could write a fictional account that was very close to the facts, that would engage the issue and could perhaps move the conversation.
Let's hear from Rena in Singapore. Are you out of quarantine?
Hi, Professor Dreyfus. Hi, Professor
Hi.
Oreskes.
Hi, Rena.
No, I'm still here at my parents' home. Yeah, so thank you, Professor Oreskes, for sharing your insights with all of us today. My name is Rena, and I'm a student with the Sustainability Management Program. And here's my question. Scientific research is often funded by governments or corporations. That is, there are certain conditions imposed on the researchers. Do you think science and scientists become less trustworthy because of this?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think this is a big issue that the community has not grappled with even close to sufficiently. So a few minutes ago, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences study, and one of the other areas in which they was distrust of science was when people thought this had been influenced by a corporate interest. And of course, it shows the American people are pretty smart, because actually American people are right to be at least somewhat skeptical if there's a corporate interest, because we know that not in cases, but in interest can in fact skew science. There's been a lot of great science funded by corporations in the history of in the early part of the century. Many corporations like GE, Westinghouse, Eastman Kodak had large research laboratories of their own, and some of them did very fine science. At General Electric, there were Nobel Prizes won for scientific research done in the GE labs. So the fact that science is supported by a corporation doesn't necessarily make it bad, but have some very conspicuous examples where the science was distorted by corporate interests. The tobacco story is the most documented, but it's only one. So my view of that is twofold. I think that all universities across the board, absolutely, with no exception, need to have policies for full disclosure, which say scientists have to disclose at times who's funding their research, so that if there is a question about it, we can ask those questions. There should be a policy that no funds should ever be accepted at a university if they involve non-disclosure requirements. And that's the other part of it. So sometimes when people take corporate funding, they need the permission of the funder in order to be able to publish the results. And if the results are not favorable to the corporate sponsor, they sometimes get buried. And I think this should be completely unacceptable. I think all universities, without exception, should have policies that say, we only accept corporate funding if there's an agreement that whatever the results are, they can be published. Because it's all about letting the fall where they fall. I was talking earlier about how my own views about the nastiness of academic life had been changed by the work I had done. The whole point of science is that it's of discovery, and sometimes we find out that what we thought we might not like, or that are inconvenient truths. And science can only work and will only be worthy and will only deserve the trust of the American people if we know that the results will be disclosed no matter what. And so I think that's absolutely essential. And I would really like to see the leadership of the scientific community, whether it's AAAS or the National Academy of Sciences, one of these groups, really take a leadership role and up, because it wouldn't be that hard to do. And if we did it uniformly, then our sponsors would have to, because they wouldn't really have anywhere else to go.
Let's hear from, thanks, Rena. Let's hear from Andreas, a member of the class who's a diplomat. Andreas?
Thank you, Professor Dreyfus and Professor Oreskes, for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. My name is Andres Cordova. I'm a student of the Executive Master of Public Administration at Columbia University, graduating in a couple of weeks. My question is, it would seem that some politicians still see scientists as if they were fortune tellers. How can scientific knowledge become of political interest and a constant input for common good policies, surpassing the economic interests of a few?
Oh, that's a rough question. I think there's always going to be a tension in political life between short-term economic interests, longer-term. And one of the challenges of science is that we tend to deal with the long term. I mean, not always. COVID is an example where there was immediate and acute, but in general, many of the things we study have to do with long range benefits, but not always short range benefit. And one of the challenges of all environmental problems is that they often involve some kind of upfront cost, some kind of investment, which will be paid back. Will benefit in the long by doing these things, and the economy will benefit, and jobs will benefit, and prosperity will benefit, but the result may be in time for the next election. So this is always a challenge for science at the interface with politics. The best I can suggest that this is where history of science can help. We certainly have many examples in the history of science. Scientists were called upon to support the nation state quite brilliantly. And so I think to the extent that politicians know that and understand that, that may be one way to make for why it is important to have science, robust scientific infrastructure, and to listen to what scientists say.
We have questions from some of folks who've logged in and are part of our course tonight. Most of the questions that they've sent in are sort of practical questions. Like many of us, they want to know what's going on in this crisis, and those we're going to put aside because the really important things that Naomi can speak to, Dr. Oreskes can speak to, are more involving policy. And but here's an interesting question from a student named Kara Ferber. She asks, and she asks aspiring healthcare professionals to encourage trust in science on an individual level, as well as on a large scale. And her sub-question is, how can we leverage what has made popular doctors like Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil mainstream names? And how can we change that for the good? You're in interviewing, you're never supposed to ask two questions at once. And so why don't we just answer the first one?
Yeah, I don't know if I can really answer the question about Dr. Phil, but the first one, you know, one of the things that's weird in science is we sometimes treat it as if it's somehow different from else in our lives, kind of science exceptionalism. But when it comes to communication, what we've learned is that what works in science communication is pretty much what works in community in general, which is making the connection. So if you think about our ordinary lives, you meet someone at a party, you someone at work, we talk about our lives, we talk about who we are, we share about ourselves. Well, it turns out that works in scientific communication too. When scientists talk about when they talk about their motivations, they got them excited about science in the first place, or what their work's about, or what the potential benefit of that work is. Most people are interested. People would like to hear that. And we do have evidence that when scientists talk human to human about their work, that people generally do feel scientists trustworthy. So that tells us that the person action, the personal interaction is really crucial. The other thing I think we know is that most people are really interested in science. If you think about it, lots of people go to aquaria, to planetaria, to museums freely on their own accord, honestly. Well, not now, but not in a lot. One of the things people in their free time is go learn about science in that world. Science museums are incredibly popular destinations for families with children. So that tells us that people are actually interested in science. People like science. People want to know more about it. That's great because that's the counterweight to the problem we talked about earlier about the fact that we were telling a lot of bad news stories. Yes, it's true, climate change is a bad news story, but we have a lot that's interesting that people are interested in. And once we can connect on that sort of basic level of being interested in science, being interested in the world, then we can tell, yeah, it's true, climate change is kind of a bummer, but there are solutions, and some of the solutions are actually pretty terrific. So we could talk to you about that as well.
Daniella, are you with us? Where are you?
Hi, yes, I'm in Harlem.
A stone's throw from Columbia.
Yes, very close.
As the pigeon flies.
Hi, Doctor.
So, your question.
Yes, hello. So again, I'm Daniella. I'm a current candidate for an MPA degree, emphasizing environmental science and policy, and I'm graduating in the next few weeks. And my question is, how have you dealt with bullying from oppositional politicians, and has it affected your home life, if at all?
How have I dealt with bullying? That's a tough one. Well, I feel like kind of pathetic. I mean, what kind of person resorts to bullying? It's a person who has nothing to say. It's a person who has no argument, right? And so when I encounter bullying, it's just a reminder that, we have the facts on our side, we have the arguments on our side, we have the truth on our side, and we also have the common good, the public good on our side. So morally, politically, ethically, scientifically, like we've got it all and they've got kind of nothing. So if you think of it that way, actually have a little compassion for them. You can actually feel human compassion. And then you can also stand up to it and just say ridiculous, you know, and I don't need to be moved by it. I don't need to answer it. I don't have to respond to trolls on Twitter. It's a waste of time. I certainly get upset about it. Now, I say that with 20 years of experience because I would be lying to admit that when I first started, it was quite frightening. And some of you read that Fred Singer, climate denier extraordinaire, who we focused on in Merchants of Doubt, died week. Claudia will appreciate this. The obituary writer from the New York Times asked me for a comment, and I said, well, you're not supposed to say bad things dead, and I have nothing good to say about Fred Singer. So, you know, but he tried to bully me. Early I first started doing this work, and I didn't
tried to get you fired.
Tried to get me fired job. I didn't really know who he was. I didn't really appreciate what up against. So that was a frightening in my life. And I got sick. You know, I developed a stress illness. So I won't pretend that it was fun or nice, but I think the good thing about, I mean, 20 years ago, I didn't know what this was. We didn't know what this was. I had to talk to colleagues about it. Most of my colleagues didn't know what it was either, although the good news was I got connected with a few people who actually did know who he was. And then that was sort of partly what led to writing the book. Now we know what these people are about. We know that they're bullies. We know they have no argument. And knowing that, there is a kind of power in that. And so I would encourage you, if you encounter it, just, you know, do the Christian thing. I can say this because I'm, you know, turn the other cheek, walk away. You've got a job to do. You know what your job is. And these people are trying to distract you. They're trying to divert you. So don't let them do that. Don't let them divert you. Keep your eye on the prize, work, and you're going to be okay, right?
Madeline Siegel, where are you?
Hi, I'm coming to you live from northern New Jersey.
Live is good.
Yes, glad to be live. Yeah, and Dr. Oreskes, it's such a joy to be with you virtually, so thank you so much for sharing your time. I've been spotlighted. Great. Been waiting for this.
And you look terrific.
Yeah, I finally got the lighting just about
right. I like the blue background. It's good.
Yeah, I will give you a tour. But first, a question. So I'm currently a graduate student pursuing my Master's of Science in the Earth Institute, focusing on sustainability science, how we communicate science for law and policy. And I actually had the chance to work at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law on a joint initiative with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. Yeah, where you sit on the board. And so as you've discussed, we're seeing a silencing of science by the current administration from COVID to climate change. And you did mention some roots of this distrust in the Reagan administration. So I was wondering, is this rejection of science that we're seeing by the current administration part of a longer pattern, or is this unprecedented?
Definitely part of a longer pattern. I think it's kind of apotheosis of what's been brewing for years. And my hope is that it's sort of the final last of what is now a defunct ideology, an ideology whose limits have now clearly been exposed. I wrote a piece in the Los Angeles Times about this last week, so if you haven't seen that, you might want to look at it. But that's essentially what we are in that piece, Eric Conway and I. You know, we could argue about Ronald Reagan and whether or not government grown too big. We can argue about the legacy of the New Deal, but whatever the merits or demerits of Ronald Reagan's argument, there's just no question that the pendulum has swung way, way far, and that we have important major issues about public health, about climate change, the opioid crisis, public, housing, and big problems that the marketplace simply has not solved. Could it have solved it in theory? Who knows? I don't know. I mean, that's a theoretical question. But what we know is that in practice, leaving these things to the sector has not worked. And in the case of COVID-19, the result is that people die. And that's just black and white. And I think that's the story we need to tell. And we need to say, this pendulum headed way too far. It is time to reclaim of governance and to recognize are these large problems that government cannot, that the private sector cannot solve on its own. One of the pieces recently I said, government is not the solution to all problems. We're all regular about that, but it is the solution to some of these problems. That's what we need to tell, and that's what we need to remind people. And we need to not be intimidated, to get back to the previous question, by the bullying. I mean, our current president is like the bully in chief, right? And lots of people get intimidated by it. So we say, no, we're not going to be intimidated. As I said before, we have the facts on our side, we have public sides, and this is really about the future of our country, the future of our people. Something sort of tragic. Just before I logged in tonight, someone sent me a piece from the Washington Post that had a photograph of one of these protests that's taking place, where someone had a sign, "We are not all in this together." And I have to say, it breaks my heart. Actually, I do feel sad for that person. I feel like anyone who feels that, I mean, think about how incredibly sad that is. I just think that's wrong. I think we are all in this together. I think we're together, we're happier, we're stronger. And we know we cannot solve public health problems as individuals. We learned that back in the days of diphtheria. We saw it in the Ebola crisis, and we're seeing it again today with COVID-19.
Yes, Maya, let's hear from you. Where are you?
Hi, I'm here on Roosevelt Island in
Maya is writing the most incredible term project about how the Roosevelt Island that she grew up in has changed since the coming of Cornell Technion to the island. Anyway, Maya, your question.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Oreskes, for being with us today. It's been really wonderful to hear you speak. My question for you is this. In your 2015 TED Talk, you discussed the process by which scientists collectively judge evidence and come to consensus on data. How does a phenomenon like a deadly pandemic, like the one we're in now, with high stakes and a huge time crunch to find a cure or a vaccine, put pressure on the scientific process of coming to consensus? And would this time crunch and high stakes account for why recent antibody tests have underdelivered?
Okay, well, again, two questions. I can't talk about the test because I have no idea the CDC. I don't know if it was a scientific or a political failure they were under. I do not know what happened there. I think it's going to be really important in the future, some journalists, smart students to dig into that and figure out, what went wrong there. But the first one, you're absolutely right. Science, as it's normally, in a way, is a very luxurious activity because scientists have the luxury of taking the time to figure it out. It's an incredible gift that I think we don't share enough. And one of the reasons why scientific results, in my opinion, are typically reliable is because we, in fact, do take the time whatever time it needs to the question, that's the time we take. And if you ask science before they get there, we don't know. We have to do research. So we have a problem like COVID-19 where suddenly the problem is upon us and we don't have that luxury. And so obviously it's like this, we have to do the best we can with the available evidence. And we were talking about Dr. Fauci. I think he's done a very good job in that case of being honest with the uncertainties, but saying based on the information we have, we're clear that we could reduce the death rate if we do things. But that said, there's an important backstory that we told that people need to be reminded about. The COVID-19 crisis didn't December. The virus emerged in China and began sickening and making people die. The story goes way, way farther. And this again is, I think, we need to tell when the immediate crisis is. We could say it goes back maybe to the start of what geologists are now calling the Anthropocene. Scientists have been thinking for a long time about that of a zoonotic pandemic. That is to say, a pandemic in where a virus moves from an animal to a person. And we've known for a long time that there is a class of viruses do this. Many ordinary flu viruses do this. But scientists have been also warning for a time now that the fragmentation of habitat, the increasing pressure on populations of wild animals is causing more of the source of interactions that can lead to viruses like this crossing over bat or some other wild animal into a human population. And there is now strong evidence, and I checked yesterday my friends at School of Public Health to make sure this was right, because I wanted to be able to answer this question. There's strong evidence that that is what has happened in this case. So it means that we have been ignoring scientific evidence about this potential pandemics like this, not just for the last months, last 30 years. And then add to that the scientific warnings for the health community. So the public health has been warned for decades. We were not prepared for a pandemic of this type. In fact, in 1980, the Institute of Medicine wrote a major report, which you can find online, in which they explicitly laid out the major response to increased preparedness for a pandemic. Explicitly said that traditionally public health has been under the rubric of the states, and for many things that's fine. But when it comes to the threat of a pandemic, the states don't have the capacity to produce the focused and structured response that you need. So I was reading this and I thought, oh my God, this has been written last week. So science is warning that we're underprepared for something like this. And then just like Johns Hopkins, the conference, which just explicitly addressed of a major respiratory and how we were under for that. So yes, it's true in a way, this is an issue where suddenly it was upon us and we didn't really have the luxury of thinking it through. Other way, that's actually not what scientists have been thinking this through for more than years. And our federal government has been ignoring the advice scientists have trying to give them.
Brighton, I'm wondering if you have a question. Do you have a question, Brighton?
Hey, Professor Dreyfus. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Oreskes. I was introduced to your work. Oh, by the way, I'm in the MPA Environmental Science and Policy program. And I was introduced to your work by Professor Louise Rosen in one of my capstone projects on pesticides, Saving America's Pollinators Act, which I worked on last semester. My question to you is, you've been testifying in Congress lately. What is the one message you most want to send to politicians?
I think if there were one thing I would like to say, it's that the classic dichotomy of jobs versus the environment, or the economy versus public health, that this is a false dichotomy. The enormous amount of evidence that when we protect public health or that when we protect the environment, it actually fits the economy. Healthy people generate more wealth. The economy generates more jobs, fossil fuels. Don't cut down forests, you generate revenues in all kinds of ways. Revenue, the healthier population. If you go back to, say, the days of the Clean Air Act, there were people who warned that this would, cost huge amounts. In fact, every seen some major environmental protection proposed, there's always someone in the corporate sector or someone on the conservative side of the aisle, oh, this will cost too much money, we can't afford it. But we have so many good examples now in which these things have proven to generate revenue, to generate jobs, and net gains, not just in terms of things like natural beauty, but actually in terms of the economy as well. And I think that message could be a way to break through this sort of right-wing, left-wing polarization. I mean, I'm not claiming this will be easy. I think these positions are so entrenched that it's going to take something close to divine intervention. Somebody mentioned Bob Inglis the other day. He's a religious person, so I hope that he is praying to God for an appropriate intervention. Meanwhile, in case that doesn't happen, I think we can make this case. And so I would argue that for those of you who, if you're motivated to get educated on any particular thing, very good evidence now on the economic benefits of environmental protection and the economic benefits of public health. And of course, we're seeing it now. Countries that did not have responded early to the COVID-19 threat, who had adequate test procedures, who had contact tracing, many of them have not had to shut down the economies the way we, and their economies are doing better. So when they listened and took proactive steps, it actually protected the economy. And I think that's a really crucial message that we need to get across.
We need to hear from, last but not least, Linnea Armstrong. Where are you, Linnea, today?
Hello, thank you to you both. I am in Northern California, which I here is much warmer than the East Coast right now, so I'll try not to brag too much about that. But
climate change again.
I'm sure many of us, if you're like me, have been pretty glued to the news lately and, craving these daily updates. But unfortunately, the peer-reviewed research process isn't quite in sync with our instant news cycle. So I'm wondering, as a science communicator, how do you grapple with that?
Well, there's a tension, and obviously Professor Dreyfus knows this better than I do, between the pace at which science develops versus the pace at which daily newspapers or television or radio operates. But again, there's often these large stories that need told. So there's an opportunity for journalists and people like myself to tell the story about the way in which fragmentation has made some pandemics more likely, or the way climate change is contributing to, threats to public health. There are all kinds of ancillary related questions that connect to this moment, but are not restricted to this moment. And, one of the things I don't want to watch television news, but of course, as you said, like everyone else, I have seen these last few weeks. Sometimes you feel like they're just desperately trying to fill up the airwaves, and they're looking for some story to tell. This gets back to the question we had. Almost always human interest, right? Someone, who has had COVID-19, or, we get Chris Cuomo's his daily updates from his basement, right? So they're interested in the human side of the story, but they're also craving real information. And I think there's a lot of information there about in general, about zoonotics. I think most people don't even know what a zoonotic is. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to be telling these larger stories. And that's what I would encourage all of you to have the opportunity, not to have to be restricted by the news cycle. And of course, you have an example in your professor, because, professors many stories that are not about what happened today, but are about larger trends and developments in science.
Thank you. Josh Herring out in Iowa, I don't know if your connection is good enough, if we can hear you, if you can hear us. Do you have a question? You always have such good ideas in class. Well, one question from our audience out there, and Gesundheit, or whatever.
I know you feel like if you cough now, you have to like tell people, oh, don't worry,
Well,
it's just a scratchy throat for an hour and a half.
Well, as long as you don't do it in public, because you scare people.
Well, I'm at home, so there's no coughing.
There's someone out there named Rachel Courtney who's a guest, and she says, is it not proven that humans naturally have a tendency towards positive thinking? And can this trait get in the way of our ability to take all of this in?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah,
well, of course, it's not proven, because human behavior is an incredibly complicated thing, and people behave differently in different situations, and Americans behave different than French people who do differently than Japanese. I think there's an argument, particularly in American culture, we're so ingrained in the notion of the power of positive thinking that I think sometimes it does make it hard for us to acknowledge when there's something bad, when there's a serious threat we have to deal with. And there may be an evolutionary component to this. My buddy Vijay, late, and I've forgotten the name of a good colleague of mine, but he's got a book called Denial. Arkit Vaj. Okay, I've forgotten. Anyway, I can send it to Claudia later. But anyway, Denial, and he has a whole evolutionary theory about why it's in our nature to deny bad news. I'm not completely convinced of that. I think a lot of this is as much cultural as biological. And I see that in ways in which people in different countries respond to news. And even in this particular example, it's between how South Korea responded to this issue versus the United States. But I think it is true that there is a tendency in American culture, and that is a challenge. You have to find ways to tell the truth about serious, difficult problems, but then also pivot into solution space and to say it is bad, but there are things we can do. And so, and there are many ways that play, but one example I like to talk about a lot in my own work is that the solutions to climate change are great. they're as good or better than what we have now. So for example, when I moved to Massachusetts 7 years ago, I put solar panels on my roof. Now, Massachusetts is not a particularly sunny place, but it's sunny enough. And now about 80% of the electricity in my house comes from tech energy. And guess what? When I turn on the lights, they're just as bright as they ever were. My electricity is just as good. In fact, it's because it's cheaper. And actually, it's also better because I've replaced light bulbs with LEDs, and so they're actually brighter. So I've experienced no sacrifice at all, no sacrifice, no hardship, no freezing in the dark suffering. The only hardship is I had to pay up front, invest up front in that system. And it was expensive to put in, but I mean, the money back and all the money the return on investment is pretty good. So there are issues about financing. This is why we need things like green development banks. Not everybody has the cash on hand to pay installation on, so we need to figure out ways to finance it. These solar farms are one solution. But the point is, the solutions are there, and they're good and work, and they generate prosperity, and they give me electricity that's just as good, if not better, than what I had before.
And cheaper. In closing, I'm just wondering how you're doing in this weird situation that we're all in. How are you sheltering in place, and what have you learned from it? 2 questions, right?
Well, the main thing I've learned is it's really good to have a wine cellar. I'm in really great shape. I feel like the only thing I'm suffering is the surreal existence where I live in a house. You can see my study. I have a lovely study. I was set up to work before this happened. My husband already did home, so we didn't have to buy desks. We had what we needed. We have local farms that are open year round, so I've been able to get great food. So eating better than usual. But it's the surreal thing of like, we're fine and a lot of other people aren't. And of course that in a way capitulates the larger story of American culture, right? I mean, we live with giant inequalities in this country that predated COVID-19. So it's made me think a lot about the fact that during daily life, we take those inequalities for granted. And it's made me feel more determined not to take them for granted going. And of course, there's my students who are worried about their future. They're worried about getting their PhDs finished. I have a lot of students who need to go to the archives are closed. The university has not yet said if it will give students additional funding. So, you know, there's a lot of work to kind of hold everyone together. But I do have a wine cellar. My husband and I had a bunch of wines we were saving for a special occasion. We decided this is a special occasion. So, you know, like I said, so I'm fine. I'm good. Thank you for asking. You don't have to worry about me, but we do need to worry about all the people out who are suffering.
Well, on that note, it's a good note. I really thank you for taking the time. I know that with the Earth Day anniversary coming up, everybody and their brother and mother have been on the phone to you for quotes.
Yeah, it's been a busy week. I've got to do another one of these tomorrow. So, but it's worth it. So thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's been great. And good luck to all the students. I hope you all can continue doing your great work.
Thank you, Naomi Oreskes. Good night to all our friends out there. And we will see you later on in the term. This is kind of the end of the semester for us at Columbia, and finals week, however it is coming up. We've got another couple of weeks in my class when the students are preparing long form magazine feature articles on scientific issues, and the stuff that they are producing in draft is really interesting and very gratifying just to see. So I thank Jasmine, who's been a terrific TA. I thank the incredible crew at the School of Professional Studies who managed to get everything together on 2 days' notice when we were all thrown on campus and told, get out of here, go home and shelter, and still have managed to keep things up and running and make it interesting. We've transitioned very well at the School of Professional Studies. And it's been a learning experience. Everyone out there, I wish you good health. That old cliche that your mother said, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. Well, Mama was right. So take care of yourselves out there.